Kenneth Branagh may be widely recognized from his acting in films like Oppenheimer and Anti-Semitic Wizard Boy 2, but he is also an incredibly prolific director. In fact, with 20 films under his belt, he is the most prolific director that I'm currently planning to cover in this series. And having said that, this video is going to be long enough, and I don't want to spend too much time on this intro. So... While I admit that I'm not the biggest Shakespeare fan, I can respect how much Kenneth Branagh cares about adapting Henry V to screen. Branagh places himself in the leading role, which we will see a lot more of throughout his career. Here, at least, it feels like the best choice. He gives a very intense performance, showing he understands Shakespeare's script much more than I could hope to. As for his directing, Branagh brings a gritty style to the film that accents the harsher battle scenes very well, while providing a dark undertone to the more regal environments. I am particularly a big fan of the way the chorus is implemented into the film. A modern man lays the various scenes for the audience, even opening the film on the production soundstage before welcoming us in to join the characters on set.
It is as easy for me, Kate, to conquer the kingdom as to speak so much more French. I will never move thee in French unless it be to laugh at me.
Dead Again is one of those movies that's difficult to talk about because you don't want to give too much away, but I'll try. This film is an exciting entry into the neo-noir genre that manages to balance its more high-concept elements with an engaging romantic plotline. Clearly, Branagh realized his mistake of only sharing one scene with Emma Thompson and Henry V because Dead Again really shows off their fantastic chemistry. Mike and Grace's relationship shifts and evolves so much over the course of the film's 107-minute runtime, and these two actors manage to play off of each other so well during all of it. Aside from them, the film makes good use of Robin Williams and Wayne Knight in its supporting cast. Part of me wishes we could have seen more of them, but another part of me thinks they were utilized exactly how they needed to be to keep the film rolling.
I thought karma was I do something bad in this life, I'm a termite in the next one.
Hey, you ask me, you're already a termite in this life in a shitty suit, okay?
Peter's Friends is a film about a group of friends, who'd have guessed, reuniting after 10 years away from each other to celebrate the coming new year. Along the way, they learn a few new things about themselves, but more importantly, break through barriers towards things they've already known. This film does not feature the most savory cast of characters. In fact, some of them are downright insufferable, but luckily those ones leave the film before it's over. Once again, Kenneth Branagh includes himself as the lead, though he is not the titular Peter. That role goes to Stephen Fry. Also returning from Branagh's previous work is Emma Thompson, but for the first time she does not play Branagh's romantic interest. Instead, her character Maggie finds herself attracted to Peter. Peter is revealed in this film to be bisexual, and as someone who is bisexual myself, I was pleased to see such explicit representation in a film from before I was born. While the representation itself is quite surface level, it is more than I expected of the time, especially considering that movies and TV today still skirt around the word bisexual. I do enjoy the ending to this film quite a bit, though the road there is not without its issues.
It could have been worse. Oh, yes, sir, it could have been worse. They could have attached electrodes to our genitals.
I would like to walk back a little bit of what I said earlier about Shakespeare, or at least add more nuance to the statement. Much Ado About Nothing made me realize that I am able to enjoy Shakespeare quite a bit, at least when he's writing comedy. And I don't mean comedy in the literal Shakespearean sense, where every play with a happy ending is a comedy. Instead, I mean how we use it now, which is jokes. It is, of course, no revelation to say, hey, you know what, this Shakespeare guy really knows how to write. But I just found myself cracking up at all the humor in this movie. While the jokes themselves are hilarious, they are elevated even further by the incredible deliveries, particularly from, you guessed it, Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson, who, unsurprisingly, continue to show off their incredible chemistry in this film. Aside from just those two, this film is full of rich performances. Denzel Washington oozes charm, Keanu Reeves plays a layered villain, and Michael Keaton steals every scene he's in. I was a little less interested in the second half of the movie, which lowered the emphasis on humor to make room for the more dramatic storyline. I still believe this part of the film is very well done, I just found myself enjoying Branagh's and Thompson's characters much more. I would still need to see a performance of an unabridged script, but after seeing this film, I believe that Much Ado About Nothing will rank among A Midsummer Night's Dream as one of my favorite Shakespeare works. Kenneth still has plenty more he wants to show me, though, so we'll see.
Masters, remember, I am an ass. Though I be not written down, forget not that I am an ass.
Kenneth Branagh's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a much more faithful adaptation of the original novel than the classic Universal film. And when it does deviate from the story of the novel, I think it makes some good choices that keep the pace of the film running. While I've seen many complaints that this film is too over the top, it's that element that I enjoy the most about it. Based on his multitude of Shakespeare adaptations, it's clear to me that Kenneth Branagh is a man who loves the theater, and in this film particularly, he attempts to bring an incredibly theatrical quality to the screen. From the dramatic performances to the strong cinematic choices, Branagh imbues this film with a clear style. While this film may not be everyone's cup of tea, and I certainly don't find it to be perfect, it may just be my favorite direct adaptation of Frankenstein. Though maybe I should reserve that judgment until Guillermo del Toro's movie comes out.
It's alive. It's alive.
In the Bleak Midwinter, or A Midwinter's Tale as it was renamed here in the States, is a comedy about a struggling out-of-work actor attempting to put together a performance of Hamlet in only 2 weeks. What I appreciate most about this film is the comedy itself. While there is the occasional slapstick, it's very sparsely used, and instead the film relies on the wit of its script. Many of the jokes are cleverly written in such a way that you don't even realize they're being set up until the punchline comes. Branagh has also assembled a good cast for this film, though for the first time it does not include himself. These are actors who definitely understand their roles and how to bring them to life. I am particularly a fan of John Sessions as Terry, and Richard Briers as Henry, and the way their friendship builds over the film. While the film is far from perfect, it was an enjoyable watch, and I wouldn't feel bad recommending it.
You're not going to drive that old heap, are you? With live people in it?
With actors in it, there is a difference.
Going from one Hamlet film to another, Kenneth Branagh makes the bold choice to create this film with a completely unabridged script. Every single line that Shakespeare originally wrote is present in this film, and while I admire that in theory, was this really the play to do that with? This movie is so long, and even though it has its good moments, it's really hard to appreciate them when I'm 3 hours into this movie, Hamlet won't stop screaming, half the scenes are just people standing around, and I just want it to all be over. Is this a bad movie? Not at all. It has incredible set design, and for the most part, it's very well acted, save for Branagh himself, who, as I mentioned earlier, won't stop screaming. I can even understand why this is not only regarded as the best Hamlet film, but one of the best Shakespeare films of all time. It just isn't for me. I'd rather watch the full performance from the actors in the last movie. At least they cut their script down.
Will you tell us what this show meant?
Irony show that you'll show him. Be not you ashamed to show, he'll not shame to tell you what it meant.
Kenneth, what happened to you in the 4 years between Hamlet and Love's Labour's Lost? You went from making a 4-hour film just so every single line of the original script would be included, to cutting 3/4 of the script, adding news broadcasts that are not written in iambic pentameter, and most jarringly, turning the movie into a jukebox musical full of songs from the 1930s. Now, I personally have absolutely nothing against musicals, but the way this script was turned into one makes absolutely no sense. It was not rewritten to be a musical. Instead, songs are just jammed into the script, and while some of the songs are used to move the plot forward, like how a musical typically does, most just stop the story completely in its tracks. This isn't to say I despise the film entirely. I think the comedy comes across very well for the most part, and the cast is good, though there isn't much to separate the characters apart from each other, but that's probably more Shakespeare's fault. At the end of the day, though, it's just not very cohesive and comes across quite messy.
Pray you, sir. Whose daughter?
Her mother's, I have heard.
With the exception of Much Ado About Nothing, Kenneth Branagh has progressively gotten worse with his Shakespeare adaptations. Luckily, this is his last one. This time around, his changes to the original script just lead to an utterly confusing mess of a movie. It's so hard to track what's even going on from one moment to the next. Perhaps the most baffling choice, though, is to set this adaptation in 19th century Japan, but shoot in England, and make all the major characters Europeans in kimonos. It seems to me that Branagh just wanted the aesthetic of Japan, but didn't want to make any effort to incorporate the culture.
I am here with thee, and thy goats.
The Magic Flute is an adaptation of Mozart's opera by the same name, translated from the original German into English, and set during World War I. I am not a huge fan of operas, but I still wanted to give this a fair shot. If there's anything we've learned by now, it's that Kenneth Branagh loves to make his films as theatrical as possible, and he certainly does not let up here. The film seems to be a fairly accurate adaptation, and is clearly well made, aside from the strange CGI that pops up every once in a while. While I don't outright hate this movie, it was always going to be an uphill battle for something like this to win me over.
I speak in fluent Pigeonese and charm the birds right off the trees.
I had an absolute blast watching Sleuth. Michael Caine and Jude Law play these parts so well. You can't tell if they absolutely despise each other or if they're madly in love. Probably both. Both of these actors bring the highest levels of animosity and adoration towards the other, but I want to bring special attention to Jude Law, who gets absolutely deranged at points. The cinematography is also incredible. I love the shot composition in this film. It's constantly twisting around alongside the narrative in a way that just feels right. I desperately want to see a professional stage production of the original play now.
She told you I was no good in bed?
Oh, yes.
She was joking. I'm wonderful in bed.
I must tell her.
Thor was given a difficult task of balancing the regal Shakespearean realm of Asgard with the more comedy-focused antics of small-town New Mexico. And for the most part, the film does this pretty well. It never feels too jarring when we switch between these two locales, and I think we largely have Thor as a character to thank for that. Chris Hemsworth's performance serves very well to anchor him between these two worlds, and he's given a well-written arc over the course of the film where he learns about humility and what it means to truly be worthy of his power. Unfortunately, the film gets a little messier in its third act. The weakest part of this film is its fight sequences, and the third act is basically just two of those back-to-back. Also, good lord, Kenneth, you want to chill out on all those Dutch angles?
We don't have horses, just dogs, cats, birds.
And give me one of those large enough to ride.
Jack Ryan's Shadow Recruit is an incredibly average espionage spy film, which wouldn't be the worst thing on its own. Plenty of the movies I've watched for the series are worse than average. What makes that worse for this movie is that Jack Ryan is not supposed to be about spycraft and espionage. Jack Ryan is an analyst, and that's most of what he does, analyzing. While I personally found that to be pretty boring in the other Jack Ryan films, that's clearly the identity of this series. But Shadow Recruit wasn't interested in being a Jack Ryan movie, which begs the question, why is this a Jack Ryan movie? It's the only film in the series to not be based on a specific book by Tom Clancy. Instead, it just plucks a few character names out and makes up the rest. I probably would have enjoyed this at least a little bit more if it was just its own original IP.
Jesus, you weren't kidding. You are in the CIA.
Somebody has to be.
I've already ranted to you all about my disdain for Disney's live-action remakes, but on a quality scale, this one leans much, much closer to The Jungle Book than it does to The Lion King. I would imagine that's largely due to this being one of the earliest live-action remakes, before Disney just started churning them out. Let me start with a few things I like in this version. I like how much more of a character the prince is in this movie. We get to see him be a constant force in moving the story forward, and Richard Madden is, dare I say, quite charming in the role. I like that this movie knows and respects that you've probably already seen the animated classic, and doesn't just give you a one-for-one retelling. It knows what you expect to see out of this movie, and twists it just a little bit, while still mostly remaining faithful to the spirit of the original. I also appreciate that there are a couple small details from the original fairy tale that didn't make it into the animated movie, but did get into this one. At the same time, though, this movie just wildly shifts tone at certain parts. For example, when the fairy godmother shows up, the next 5 to 10 minutes of the movie are inexplicably a slapstick comedy. It also has some uncomfortable visuals, but I suppose the original had that too. While this film is far from perfect, the modern Disney remakes could certainly learn something from it 10 years later. Or they could just, stop.
I can't drive. I'm a goose.
This movie is a decent adaptation of the Agatha Christie novel, but I certainly have my problems with it. The pacing just doesn't feel quite right, as if the movie isn't actually interested in letting the audience solve the mystery alongside Poirot. I also have a problem with some of the characters being drastically different than they are in the book. Particularly, Poirot feels too cocky and combative, but that is only based on reading the one book that this particular film is based on out of the 50-something Hercule Poirot books Agatha Christie wrote. I will say in this movie's favor, however, that it is very nice to look at. I really appreciate the way it makes choices with its cinematography to make you feel like you're crammed into these cramped spaces, or stranded in those outdoor scenes. Overall, the movie is just fine, but it doesn't really scratch that whodunit itch for me like Knives Out or Clue. Is that just because I finished reading the book earlier that day and already knew whodunit? Maybe, but I would also be down to rewatch Glass Onion whenever, so...
I can only see the world as it should be. And when it is not, the imperfection stands out like the nose in the middle of the face.
Kenneth Branagh's obsession with William Shakespeare has evolved to a new level. No longer satisfied with just adapting his plays, Branagh has become Shakespeare in this biopic where, more likely than not, all is not true. Unlike most biopics about artists, this movie decides to focus on Shakespeare's retirement rather than his rise to stardom, or his drug problems, or that time he was a monkey. Going into this, I was pretty interested in the concept. That's not a part of Shakespeare's life I knew much about, but unfortunately this movie only turned out to be just okay. Don't get me wrong, there's some really good acting here and a few genuine tearjerkers, but the finished product is too static and slow-paced.
He was a lovely fella, but John Lane doesn't know that, and I've never let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Not a single character in the Artemis Fowl movie is recognizable as their book counterparts. Artemis is way too noble. Mulch cares too much about other people. Holly just goes along with whatever, and Artemis Sr. isn't even supposed to be here. This film barely passes as an adaptation of the book. The entire central conflict is completely changed. The end of the book states that Holly and Artemis will continue to be enemies in the future, but the movie just throws all that out the window, instead choosing to state that they will be forever friends. I didn't even grow up reading these books, but if I did, I would probably hate this movie even more. I was just going to read the first one to have as a frame of reference for reviewing this movie, but now that I've seen it, I want to read more simply so I can experience actual good stories in this world. What an absolute waste of this source material.
Listen, if I let you out, will you promise not to take command of my brain?
I want nothing to do with that brain.
Belfast definitely feels like a movie that was made first and foremost to win Oscars. Despite being about the Troubles in Ireland, it maintains pretty strict neutrality throughout. Apparently, Branagh referred to this as his most personal film, and as someone who escaped the Troubles himself as a child, you'd think he'd take a harder stance on what was happening. I wish this movie had more to say and didn't drag around so much. That said, this movie does have a few pretty emotional moments, and I do enjoy the way that the film breaks out of its black and white style when Buddy is watching a movie or play, as if art is opening Buddy up to a new world, which would certainly make sense if we are to assume that he is Branagh's self-insert in this story. Belfast could be a lot worse, but it could be a lot better too.
The Irish were born for leaving. Otherwise the rest of the world would have no pubs.
This movie is far less interesting than its predecessor. For starters, it's already based on a worse book, in my opinion. But on top of that, it doesn't have nearly as much fun with the camera work, The characters are less engaging, and the acting is a lot flatter. I did find a couple laughs here, though, particularly when the film opens with a deadly serious origin story for Hercule's mustache.
You accuse me now of murder.
Oh no, he accuses everyone of murder.
It is a problem, I admit.
A Haunting in Venice is a much looser adaptation of its respective book than the first two movies in this trilogy. I assume a large factor in that was that Disney didn't want to release a movie about child murder. Only a few details remain consistent in this adaptation, but I think that was actually a smart move here. The book, titled Halloween Party, is pretty unexciting, and I think it was the right move to let Branagh play with more creative freedoms this time around. I wish I liked Branagh's Poirot trilogy more, but at their best, these movies are just meh. This is the best one by the smallest margin, though. Tina Fey is also a very strange casting choice here. She just feels completely out of place in this movie.
You woke the bear from his sleep, you cannot cry when he tangos.
That's not an expression in any language.
With 20 films, Kenneth Branagh has painted a very clear picture for me of who he is as an artist. He has a love of theater and classic literature. He truly cares about filmmaking as an art, even if he doesn't always give his best effort to a film. In nearly every one of Branagh's films, I feel at least some level of passion, regardless of if the final product works out in the end. My average rating here for all 20 of Kenneth Branagh's films is 2.95, which places him in the middle of our leaderboard between Jon Favreau and Louis Leterrier. Currently, Kenneth Branagh is working on his next film, The Last Disturbance of Madeline Hind, a psychological thriller with very few plot details known at the moment. It began shooting in August, and there have not been any updates since. Given how frequently Branagh pushes movies out, though, I wouldn't be surprised if it hits theaters by the end of the year. Up next on our director list is Joe Johnston. Hopefully it won't take me over a year to make that one.